Hello everyone, and welcome you all to a new episode of the Geopolitical Pickle. Today we will have a really special episode because we will be talking about the elections in Brazil and how have they gone through, what problems have the candidates encountered, what are the challenges now going forward, and the impact that it's going to have both in Brazil and in the region of Latin America. For that today, I will have my colleague Alex Perry. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I will have Fede Caprari. He's our relatively common guest.
Thank you, Humphrey.
And today we have a special guest. We have Felipe Simoni. He's an intelligence analyst and he has his own podcast on international politics called Espetinho Internacional. It's in Portuguese, so if you guys want to give it a look, it's really, really interesting. Thank you, Felipe, for being here today.
My pleasure.
And I would like to start a little bit with what is the situation. Alex, could you give us some hints?
Yes, so just to give you kind of an overview of how elections in Brazil worked and what happened. So Brazil's presidential elections are held every 4 years. It's based on a 2-round voting system in which a candidate must receive more than 50% of the vote to win the first round. If no candidate passes the 50% threshold, a runoff election is held between the top 2 candidates. This year, there were 11 candidates on the ballot, but the real competition was just between 2 of them, the incumbent President Bolsonaro of the Liberal Party and then former President Lula da Silva of the Workers' Party. And this election ended up being extremely close, but ultimately Lula won the runoff election with 50.9% of the vote. So to me, I think the interesting thing was that both candidates had been president before, so they were really running on their established track record. And I don't know, I would like to open it up now to you guys and what you think the central issues were for the candidates in this election and kind of anything you know about their background.
All right. I think it's very funny how you start by saying that they've been president before, because Bolsonaro's identity as a politician is of an outsider, which is a known figure, right? Everyone knows politicians like Trump, and they come with this discourse of not being a politician before. He has been a politician for over 30 years. He's done most of, if not all, his career as a politician. But even as a president, he always claims to be this government of an exception, right? So yes, they've been president, but the war in Ukraine, but the situation with COVID, but the media. So this is not the base in which he's running for. He's trying to kind of detach himself to whatever happened in his government because it was such an exceptional situation. With Lula, on the other hand, Lula is always doing that. He's always referring to the fact that, well, you know how my governments have been. Look at how many problems I solved. Of course, it's a different context, a different moment, but he's always using that card, right? And Bolsonaro is doing the same. He points at Lula and says, well, he's been a president. You remember all the problems. You remember all the trouble. So although both have been a president in the past, it's still something that it's played very differently from each of the sides in that. But you're absolutely right. That is very relevant.
That is interesting because of the memory that the people had from the times of Lula. I mean, one of the reasons for Lula to win in these elections, one of the reasons that analysts have been giving is that people did remember from his mandate that the Brazilian economy was growing, that there was a reduction in poverty and all this matter. If I'm not wrong, there is this program called Bolsa Familia.
Yes.
That he put in place. All this, Lula stopped being president in 2010, and right. then he got arrested, put in jail, and then the condemned was withdrawn. What's the image that the people had from Lula? Because I mean, it's 12 years ago that he stopped being president. Then there was Dilma. Then there was all the problem with the car wash case.
Right.
What is the memory that the people still have from Lula?
This is the key point about Lula in his track in these elections, is that the memory is what made him win, but it's also what pushed Bolsonaro so far. When people remember Lula, they definitely remember 4% growth. They remember BRICS. They remember how universities were much more accessible. But on the other side, they also remember the scandals of corruption that were huge scandals of corruption, right? We cannot downplay any of that. And the Operation Car Wash really played a trick in it. But in a general opinion in Brazil, what you see is that people don't really separate Lula from Dilma from even Temer. They would put all together and say, well, the Workers' Party has been in power for 15, 16 years. It's not really what happened, especially because Lula's government was very different from Dilma's government, but they are all put in the same boat. And this is to say that Dilma was also kind of Lula's project, right? We have sort of internal elections in Brazil too, and the Workers' Party was not going to put Dilma forward if it wasn't for Lula being very adamant on having her as the next candidate for them. That's back in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. And then she did, and then she got there, and you can see that she's probably not as smart of a politician, or maybe not smart, but as articulate as a politician, because she couldn't keep up with whatever structures we had there. So in that sense, this is what I have to say about memory and Lula, right? It's his strong suit, it's his weakness as well. And I guess now the way that he overcame it was by making a very diverse coalition. At least 10 big parties are supporting Lula now. A bit of what happened in Czech Republic as well, to fend off the right-wing government. All of the other parties kind of got together. In that sense, we are expecting Lula to do what he does best, which is articulate with all of these different players in the table. And that is very dangerous for a politician that has had a past with corruption, particularly towards this type of, maneuvering to get everyone on his board.
Yeah, like we were actually checking that, for example, the vice president right now is the president, the leader of the center-right party, who was actually presented himself against Lula.
Yes.
So more or less, have we seen an extreme polarization in Brazilian politics due to this election, where there's two clear blocks? There's one that is anti-Bolsonaro, trying to oust him, and there's another one that is on the ones that want to take him out? Or have we seen that, or do you think that what Lula has done is properly politics? In politics, in the end, you have to agree with people, and you have to bring people together to your project. Obviously, you always have to concede something. How do you?
That's a cliche answer. I'm sorry for that, but yes and no, right?
Okay.
The way it goes is that if you look at how Brazilian politics have evolved over time, we were a mostly right-wing country, and especially after the redemocratization, you have a lot of liberal economists kind of trying to keep Brazil together and kind of arrange everything. And that's when Lula comes. He comes right after that. And Lula is the first left-wing president we have in Brazil after the redemocratization, and one of the only ones in the history of Brazil. That being so, he did have this stability to grow on, and this is what allowed Lula in the past to kind of get everyone on the same track. And, everyone was benefiting from Brazil growing with that stable economy in Lula's government. So that's how he played it. Obviously bottom up because he's left wing and all that. However, the way that Lula is portrayed and the way that he talked about himself is as if he's this revolutionary worker, syndicalist. He's really not.
Yes.
He has this story, but when he goes into government, he's a very center-left pacifist that gets bankers and the agricultural business, not the farmers, but the big farmers. That's how he plays, and this is his strong suit. The right wing always needed to portray him as this revolutionary savage, right? And the left wing too, because that's really the sort of national hero that they were trying to paint him.
It's a win-win situation for him, looking like a partisan.
Yes, but also when polarization happens, then it's a lose-lose situation for him, right?
Okay.
Because the left wing cannot subside all of that politically, and the right wing gets really radicalized when the alternative is communism. Obviously, it was never the case.
I would say this is the case better highlighted with Dilma Rousseff. Like all the campaign that they did against her is like because of her past and everything, so on and so forth. It was really used by the right wing in this case.
Absolutely. The past that Dilma has, in case you don't know, is that she fought the military dictatorship in Brazil. She was a guerrilla fighter. She was involved in violent crimes such as the kidnapping of, if I'm not mistaken, a U.S. ambassador, but if it's not US, it's one ambassador. So she did pick up arms and fought against the military dictatorship in Brazil, right? It's clearly a dictatorship. The right wing questions that, but it's part of negationism. We know it was clearly the situation there. And then it's a bit challenging to have Dilma there as a representative of the people, but it's not unheard of. We have a lot of former revolutionaries that become presidents, and that's the case. But now, to the other side of the question that you've asked me earlier, if the elections cause the polarization in Brazil, of course, social sciences is never that simple, right? It's chicken egg dilemma all the time. But in this case particularly, I think it's quite obvious that the election is a result of a polarization rather than causing it. As Fede mentioned, the election Dilma ASU in 2014, that was super polarized already. And the fake news, that was booming. They had the worst. They call Bolsonaro the Trump of the tropics, but what happened in Brazil is so much weirder. I can't even start to describe. In 2014, what was it? They were saying that there were baby balls, that the head of it was in the shape of Venus. Okay. And that was, we know in the polls, we can see a direct impact in how people voted. So people believed fake news to this extent, right?
But this is also, because you're mentioning 2014, I mean, this is early fake news. I mean, this is like, it's like we have the idea, especially in Europe, that fake news started in 2016 actually, when Brexit started. Like that's when all this fake news started. But that's actually pretty early.
It's important, I think, the role of the traditional media also in Brazil, because in many instances the channels are actually benefiting from these fake news or even generating them and promoting them. So you watch the channel because it aligns very well with your views, your ideological views, and the facts and everything can be completely twisted sometimes,
Absolutely. I would even go as far as to say that the mass media in Brazil was so powerful in the past that it shaped popular opinion. If you take all of the mass media companies in Brazil, I think they go back to only 6 people controlling it. And that's pretty intense, right? Globo back then, because it have an open signal of TV, you wouldn't have access to internet, but you'd have access to your TV in the antenna. You'd watch the soap operas, and they would use it to, make all sorts of discourses like all media would. But media in Brazil is unregulated. It's not like in the US that you have all these regulations. This is also interesting.
What does it mean? What does it mean that it's unregulated?
There's no laws against monopolies. There's no laws that would force the media to give the right of reply and all of that. It's a very soft legislation towards what they can do and they cannot do, both as huge companies and as information outlet. So when Lula comes up and says, okay, my public policy regarding that is to regulate media, people freak out and they go immediately to, that's communist censorship. What Bolsonaro did, on the other hand, and that was mostly Bolsonaro, although it started early as well. So you can see how Bolsonaro is part of this right-wing rampage that they've been going on.
Yes, exactly. Not like it started now. It's taking what was before and it's give it some.
It's very hard to detach it from the whole far-right movement that started a few months before Trump gets elected there. So you can see how it's all part of the same game. Obviously, I can't say that it's the same guys behind the curtains. That would be very conspiracy.
There's no Steve Bannon there.
Steve Bannon is literally the guy that advised Bolsonaro's campaign.
No.
Right? So in that case,
he advised many campaigns around the world in the last 10 years.
And then it's not to say like, oh, they're all in this the secret meeting controlling them. It's absolutely not the case, or at least we don't know that's the case. And but we do know that they have very similar arguments. They have very similar points of views. And they even talk to themselves openly, internationally. So you can know that that's aligned. So what Bolsonaro does is the same thing as Trump did, which is the mass media lies. They're manipulating you. And honestly, I wouldn't go so far as to they lie. It has been the case in the past, but only in very specific points. But it's something that the left wing would say too in 2014 and in the early stages of this. To the point that Globo wouldn't be able to cover protests because people just wouldn't talk to them. They'd cover it from a distance, from a helicopter, but people would just go and they would shout like, oh, you're lying. And the left wing and right wing, both of them would do the same. Now it's clearly something that's concentrated on the right wing. The right wing is much more violent towards the mass media. And that comes with the fact Bolsonaro's in power, and that's part of his discourse as well. The media is extremely happy that he's leaving because individually, he's very rude and aggressive to women in the media, absolutely.
To any reporter, he can be very gross in general.
But to women, mate, he's brutal.
Then I want to get a little bit into that because we're talking about this fake news in a way. What has been, because there's been a massive scandal in Brazil because during the elections because of this. If I'm correct, the Supreme Court, I think it is, had to actually intervene in some information that was being spread because they wanted to cut down this fake news. But still, it's been massive. It's been like at a level that it's crazy. Because the question that we were having is, how do these fake news spread throughout the population? Because we were reading, obviously, like you have some WhatsApp, some whatever, but these groups, we also know that Carlos Bolsonaro has been investigating for spreading this fake news. But how has it developed into a way? Because Brazil is a 200 plus million people country. How do you get to with those social media? I mean, in a WhatsApp group, you have 256 people. How does it get to spread that long?
In the WhatsApp group of the family.
It's
always like that.
That's exactly what it is. Do you know your auntie, the one that thinks because she has a bakery, she understands about finances and economy? That's the one. And you know your uncle, he's a truck driver. He's absolutely outraged with the prices of the oil. Can he explain how they're made? He cannot. But he can be explained how it works. And honestly, that's part of the reason why we started Espetinho Internacional, my podcast. It's because we are sick and tired as professionals to go and explain to your grandma, to your father that, listen, I can go on about why Dilma is not a terrorist for 40 minutes explaining the definition of terrorism, blah, blah, blah. And after you do all of that...
That's so difficult to explain. That's so difficult to explain. No, that's so difficult to explain to someone that thinks the opposite to you, because they're saying your terrorist is my freedom fighter.
Yes, absolutely. But that's it's part of the roles of a scientist as well, right?
Of course.
The knowledge is stuck in academia, and it's quite, it can be quite useless if it's just in a book on a shelf. So I feel as a part of the job of a scientist to kind of bring it out, and then you do it in a very nice way, in a very didactic way. We learn things about that. I've been a teacher for 10 years now, so for me, I really make an effort to make those things accessible. And then at the end of the long explanation, we are being very reasonable, and let's be fair, she's not a terrorist, but you don't have to like her, and she did commit crimes. There's 1,000 reasons to criticize her, but she's not a terrorist, all right? And then they'll say, okay, but I disagree. Or they'll send you back 2-3 WhatsApp audios with this random guy in the road saying that, we're here because Dilma's a terrorist, and they'll just go on about that. And they'll send you links from these news outlets or blogs. So you get a huge volume of information, self-referencing. So you know that the source that they have is probably the single source, or maybe 2-3 sources there. Not even based on much. So it's volume. And then I have to say that this is uncharted territory at the moment, right?
Yes.
We haven't started the formal investigations in Brazil, but we can point and guess what's going on over there, because it's one of those things. It's quite obvious. We haven't investigated, we haven't proved, so it's quite obvious, but it could always be a different story behind.
But do you think the Brazilian institutions have made a relatively good job in preventing disinformation to shape too much the elections in this case? Like the judiciary in particular, with investigations, also telling the police to do some arrests, etc., etc.
Yes and no, mate. Like, I get where you're coming from, and I think that's a good point. And in this election now, yes, they did act a lot on it, but they're being very accused of being unfair. The left wing would say they're being unfair because they've asked Bolsonaro to remove a bunch of the fake news that they've been spreading, but they've asked the left wing to remove a bunch of segments and videos from Bolsonaro's accounts themselves. So you have, for example, Bolsonaro's making comments that are very clearly, they have like a pedophile kind of tone to it. He's talking about it was how he was flirting with minor girls in this situation. He published that video. It was in his YouTube channel. He was talking about it, and that was also asked to be removed from the campaign. And then the left wing is like, oh, that's unfair, or that's crazy, why would you do it? But then it comes from this idea that it's okay, you're not going to be able to talk everything, that you're not saying everything you want or everything that's true. That's not how campaigns work. There's a lot about images that you want to preserve. There's a lot in the law that would prevent you from saying things like that. And that's part of the game. It has always been part of the game. But then on Bolsonaro's side, they would say that the left wing does it too, but they're only taking our content now. Like, why can't I say that Lula is a communist? He is. right? He's not. But if you want to say it, why can't you say it? Yeah. So there's they've been doing a good job, and you can see how these elections were much less impacted by his fake news as the other ones from 2014 were. But they are also accumulating a lot of tension in the whole system. And now maybe we could go a bit.
Yeah, no, I wanted to ask you, I mean, I don't know if it's that what you want to do, but I want to go on like what are the segments of the population that have been more touched by this in a way. If we follow, I mean, here we are geopoliticians, so we like to check a little bit in the geography and how does it affect. And to the elections in Brazil, I think it's pretty interesting how it's affected. The regions, the poorer regions, which are historically more leaning to Lula's party, to the Working Party, they haven't been that clear in their vote for Lula. Actually, not. I mean, according to the polls, Lula had 15 points over Bolsonaro in July, and it ended up being 2. But for example, which is interesting, at least for me, that places where farmers are, places where low-income people are, farmers, timbers, miners, they've voted for Bolsonaro in many places, especially in the Amazon. Why, particularly with this group? Because I assume, and by the stats, they are not the richest people in Brazil. No, they are not some people that could be touched by this. But I think it's got something to do with the policies regarding the exploitation of the Amazon, doesn't it?
And historical roots. Everything's gonna be it starts way back always in Brazil, and that's absolutely right. The argument that the elites vote for Bolsonaro, that's flawed, and it's also flawed that the bases are gonna vote for Lula. We haven't verified that. What happened to the polls is still a bit of a mystery. We're trying to figure it out. There's a lot of research and a lot of questions being raised because of that. Some people are saying it's because Bolsonaro, the right wing overall, they were very resistant to answer to the polls. So you could ask and then they would refuse. But then that would be a bit, I don't know, I think that would be a bit unprofessional from the researchers not to realize that you have a huge refusal to your questionnaire, and that would have given you some hints, right? On the other hand, what they're saying is like, listen, mate, I go to the street, I ask the questions, and that's the forms I get. I'm not trying to figure out what the result's going to be in a week or in a day. I'm getting what the results are when people reply to me in the streets. That's what I have, right? So it's disputed territory, and you're going to get all sorts of opinions here. Now, but regarding these votes specifically, about these smaller communities, particularly the extractivist communities, the way that Brazil is populated in the center and in Amazon as well is that we had to have a huge public policy that would take people there, right? So what you had is you'd get people that were moving around because of the war in Paraguay, because of many different huge movements, demographic movements that we had in Brazil, and you'd give them an opportunity. You'd say like a kind of gold rush style, like why don't you go to the wild Brazil, and you're gonna get your plot of land there, you're gonna get your cattle there, you're gonna do your own community, and that's gonna be great. And then they move there, and then there's huge farmers that already own that land. There's no documents to support any of that. That's all. It's so far back. I think the last time we've seen something like that was in the 60s. By the way, Brasilia, the capital, was built in the 60s.
Yes.
So it's everything is very recent, but everything goes very far back as well, right? So these people go there, and they're having their life there. And then one day someone knocks at your door and says, you know what, that's actually indigenous land. You have to move out, right? And they're like, wait, no, that's not what we do. Or they go to you and they say, oh, you've been selling timber. That's actually illegal, right? There's a lot of things you can't do. This is how you have to do it, or whatever. And they're very distant from the means of communication overall. Some of those communities, they can be quite isolated. So it's very easy to radicalize them as well. And let's talk about organized crime in it too, right? The violence that you have in some of those areas, that's a very high rate of violence. And all of that plays into this very complex puzzle of what's happening there, right? That being said, it's also the same case for the indigenous people. They were there, they had their lands. Most indigenous populations in Brazil, I think nowadays we have over 200 indigenous people, over 300 indigenous peoples in Brazil, over 200 different languages. And I couldn't even tell you a third of those. I don't know that because
most of them they are in the Amazon and
not necessarily. Most of them are in the Amazon, yes, but there's a lot of indigenous communities outside, even in the cities. I
would understand, but I assume like in the cities you could spot some, let's say that 100, but like in the Amazon because of its whiteness.
Still, I wouldn't know the names of those peoples because we just don't learn about them, right? So it's something that Brazilian history has neglected. That being said, they used to be semi-nomadic, so they would move from place to place and go back to this and that place. But at some stage, someone just told them, no, the way we do communities here is that you have to have your land and you have to stay there. And so they did, based on a lot of violence. And now there's this guy here that's fishing in the river, and he says that the government sent him there, or I don't know, this farmer sent him there. So what do you do about it? Because they're also, these extractivist communities, they have a huge impact for the environment. And you can see, it's very clear how indigenous populations, they are the territories that are preserving the forest the most. Yeah. So it's, can you see how complex it is? It's
yes.
Yeah. We say that Brazil's not for beginners, and it's clearly
no.
I
would add just one factor. I think Bolsonaro had developed a capacity to maybe speak directly to these communities.
Yes.
In the sense of using a lot of social media, the Facebook lives, the WhatsApp groups that spread his ideas, etc. It reaches better these communities and those people that we're saying, rather than, in my opinion, Lula and the PT.
You're absolutely right.
Because they explain to you that you cannot do this because the consequences for the indigenous, and the guys say like, well, I have to eat, that's why I go dig gold illegally, etc. And Bolsonaro speaks more directly to this guy, saying, I understand you have to do it, you're a hard worker, you go ahead and do it, who cares about the indigenous?
And he does it from a rational point of view, but not so much. That he does it from a personal point of view too, as a discourse, right? He even said, he came to say that he has this, how do you call that? It's kind of like a plate that he used to take gold from. Yeah, well,
hands.
Sift gold.
Yeah, something like that. We use a different one in Brazil, but it's something like that. He'd say like that he still did it. That he grew up in a small village and they used to do it when they were young. And every now and then, when he's free on the weekend, he'd do it just because he remembers his childhood. And he brings this. He's very, very good at this, right? So he hooks up on this history. He probably did it himself. I'm not saying he's lying, but does he do it on a weekend in Brasilia? Well, I guess that might be a bit tough, right?
Much better in Brasilia.
Jokes aside, he does that, and he also does it in the classic right-wing strategy, which is oversimplifying things, and goes and says, well, in my government, you'll be able to take all the wood you want.
Yeah.
And that's it. And on the other hand, he says it in an oversimplified way, but he really does it because he just goes in our institutions that investigate and that regulate that, and he just defunds them and fires people and all, and places people that are pro-extractivism and those.
And his comments all the time, they challenge even what the policies of the institutions are, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like IBAMA, which is the Agency for Environment in Brazil, was saying like, when we get to an illegal mining place, we will destroy the equipment that we find there. Exactly. And then Bolsonaro says on TV, no, they cannot go and destroy the equipment. What do you mean? They take the people and everything, but the equipment, you cannot destroy it. Constantly contradicting what Ibama says diminishes the authority of that institution at the end of the day.
Absolutely. So what happens with this this was a huge topic in the way he maneuvered Ibama as well, is because if you are from one of those extractivist communities, you'd have your own equipment, right? So what it says in the law is that you have to remove the equipment from the area, and if you can't, you destroy it. And then the IBAMA would destroy it, and Bolsonaro would say, well, if you got it there, you can get it out of there, right? But then what does it mean to take it out of there? Does it mean that you just bring it back to your garage and you come back on the next day? Like, or what? Do you confiscate it from them? So there's a lot of soft spots that he hits very hard. But Fede, you mentioned something that's absolutely important too, which is how Bolsonaro reaches into all of these communities. And for me, that is the key for the disinformation campaign, for his regular legitimate campaign too, which is Bolsonaro has two huge groups that support him, which is the police and then, the armed forces, security forces, let's put it that way. And then the armed forces, they have the capillarity that the armed forces have in Brazil, in this, in the Amazon and the Pantanal, in all these, wild areas of Brazil, it's huge. We have relied on the armed forces to do a lot of things in Brazil that are not their job, and they still do it, and they do it super well. The hospitals in deep Amazon, they're all campaign hospitals there. Well, not all maybe, but
they build also,
strongly.
let's say, a highway, for instance.
All of that.
And in a big family, there's always someone that is, let's say, in the military at the end of the day.
Yes, that would be very good.
In that sense, I remember reading like during the campaign that there had been some distance from the military towards Bolsonaro while the campaign was going on.
We can get to that later, but before we get there, just to conclude this idea about the capillarity, he does it in the countryside via the armed forces, particularly the army, and the urban areas. That's the military police that has a huge capillarity there, but also the Protestant church, right? So the way that Bolsonaro has articulated his capillarity in Brazilian society is very, very smart. It's super efficient. And Lula, the left wing in Brazil has been criticized for it for a few decades now, that they're not as popular as they used to be in the past. They're not as much of a base movement as it used to be in the past. And Lula said it in this campaign. So you can see how he's also trying to retake that narrative. And this is why every different week he was talking about how religious he is. He's trying to reconquer that land. He won, and now we already have one of the biggest, I think it was Edir Macedo, or was it Silas Malafaia? One of the biggest religious leaders in Brazil just going and saying, like, we forgive Lula. Like, he didn't need forgiveness, and that's what the party says, but he did bring it. And because it was really, they were demonizing Lula. They were saying that Lula was a spawn of Satan and worse.
Yes, that's incredible.
Ipsis literis, that's the text that they said. And now they're like, you know what? Maybe it's not that bad. We're okay with that. But is it a surprise? It's not a surprise. They were Lula's friend when Lula was in power, and they are again now. Everyone wins when Lula's in power, and that's what he's trying.
The case for the church in Brazil is not like also so much in one party or the other, because they have always been kind of connected to power.
Yes.
Like Temer, for instance, he always was saying like, no, I'm Protestant, whatever, etc., etc. So the church has always like a very big political position in Brazil. It's true that I think by ideology they will align more with Bolsonaro, but as you say, Lula knows that he needs them, and the church is more than happy to continue collaborating with him. That's why you see this change in message.
To be fair, though, they're always going to be conservatives with exceptions. Yeah,
exactly.
That being said, they are conservatives that would be okay talking to Lula if Lula is in power. So they are aligned strongly to right-wing conservatism, to sometimes to an extreme level.
Yeah.
But they will talk to people, right? Yeah. If you have the right tools for bargaining and all, and that's what Lula's doing. On the other hand, with Bolsonaro, it's a more open type of debate, right? They would go very far into what conservatism means, because Bolsonaro would as well. That being said, you were asking about how the military distanced themselves from Bolsonaro. This is something that's been on and off in Bolsonaro's campaign from the beginning, because we don't have a good civil-military relationship in Brazil. We had a military dictatorship that started in 1964, and it ended in 1985. Our first direct elections were in 1992, so maybe I'm a bit too old, but I guess I can say that Brazilian democracy is as old as most of the people listening to this podcast. Right? That's right. And we had a coup impeachment of Dilma in 2016. So is it even that old, right?
Ours is older than that.
There you go. Yeah.
And we still say that it happened yesterday, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And the structure that made that happen in Brazil has not gone away. We didn't do any sort of appeasement with that. There's a commission of truth that's trying to look into it, but that's very polemic, and then there's a lot of debates that happen to it, and it's very stiff, and it's not walking forward. If you compare it to Argentina, it's going to be a joke. Like Brazilian way of dealing with our past compared to what Argentina did to their military dictatorship, it's really a joke. And then you can even like it or dislike what Argentina did, but the fact is that they even came up with new methods that have shown to be very effective in how their military related to that population. Okay, they had Malvinas on the way too. Let's not talk about that.
That's a big.
But that being said, this is a thing that will impact Bolsonaro's situation with the army too. The army and the armed forces, they know that this Bolsonaro situation, let's call it that way, will be something that's going to fall on their hands. It's something that's going to make It's going to be their bill at the end of the day. That's how they say it too. The vice president is a general, and he said it himself. We all know that if this goes wrong, it's going to be on the account of the armed forces. Free translation here. That being said, so we know that they are worried about it, but they really, really trust that they can be in power again. I'm not saying that they're planning a coup. We know that they've been having very suspicious speeches, and they've said some weird stuff about it. All right, so it's dangerous. They're not being very clearly against the coup, a new coup. On the other hand, they were very much all right not going through a coup if they could be in power as they were in Bolsonaro's government. Like the amount of armed forces people, active armed forces people in his government. Yeah. The way that Brazilian law works is that you can be involved in politics if you're not in the army anymore. So if you want to be involved in politics, you go to the reserve and then you become a politician. This is not the case for a lot of the military people that Bolsonaro had in the government. Personally, I don't think it's so needed that you leave the armed forces to do something for the government. But if you start being involved in politics, parties and all that, then it gets a bit more complicated.
We're talking about ministers and then all the way below. Not even ministers, but also mid-level government positions are filled with military people. Because eventually, Bolsonaro, when pushes some policies, I think this was better identified during the pandemic with his healthcare policies. He said, I can only trust these people to do what I want to do because the rest will go against me. Every time he put a civilian, being Mandetta or the other health ministers that came, they were disagreeing with him for many reasons, in my opinion, very obvious. And eventually he said, no, you know what? So the military will do it, And he put military people in the Ministry of Health, the minister eventually, and also a lot of positions there. I must add, though, I think the military in Brazil still wants to keep the reputation as we are like the notion of state,
Yes.
that transcends a bit more like the government or the politics. Like the military is capable, as you say, we build hospital, etc. We have a big presence in Brazilian society, it's a big employer in Brazil. And so it kind of tries to keep at least this reputation for itself. And that's why they in my opinion, they would not push for a military coup, let's say. And I understand also because why with Lula, for the fact that he has been in power for many years before, the military could work also with him.
Oh, Lula was one of the best governments for the military in Brazil, in terms of investments, in terms of how much prestige they get.
I don't think the military is threatened by Lula, in the sense, if he was another candidate, let's say, or another political group, I would understand why the military would want to make a coup.
But they're afraid of the left-wing communist, right? Because the coup in Brazil happened, is claimed to have happened to defend Brazil against communism. Yeah. So when you have Lula and you have Dilma, and Lula and Dilma represent communism, for the military, that's an ideological
but I would
punch
say
to the gut.
It's more about Dilma by itself. Remember what we discussed before, like her background, how she had an impressive campaign against her because she was a militant, a terrorist, etc. Yes. I don't think that's the case with Lula. Also because he's very, I would say, more aware than Dilma. He's more capable of maneuvering Brazilian politics. And he doesn't get dragged by it. In the case of Dilma, sadly, she was not able to manage that, and eventually she fell.
Then with that, can we go a little bit like what are the challenges that now Lula is going to have as president? Because there are several, we're talking here about groups, like those are, we can consider them all pressure groups. And one pressure group that goes together with this military are some unions, like the truck union. Calling for, relatively constantly calling for a coup, in demonstrations, blockading highways. What are I would like to start a little bit with the social factors that Lula will have to face during his mandate. What are these? We were talking about before the farmers. We were talking about mining regions. Now the truck unions, we're talking about the sector, like a religious sector of the society.
Absolutely, yeah.
Society speaking, what is Lula going to be facing now?
He's going to be facing a huge challenge. First of all, to say that there's no money for it in Brazil is always going to be a lie. Brazil produces a lot of things, and there's always a lot of money. It's a matter of where is it going and what's the priority and how you're distributing it, right? And that's the challenge for Lula now. We have this I don't know how to say it in English, but there's a ceiling of investments that...
o teto de gasto.
Yes.
That's the limit the government has for public spending. Yeah.
But particularly in education and health. And there's other areas too, but in these two particularly, that's been quite strong. So to control the domestic debt, we had this thing that there's only so much you can invest in those areas. A lot of governments have bursted this limit a couple of times. When I mean a lot, I mean Dilma, Temer, and Bolsonaro did it too a bunch of times. But now, if you see, Bolsonaro's government spent a lot of money. So when Dilma left government, I think it was 380 billion, I'm not sure, but 380 lots of money that she left in the balance. And then Bolsonaro's got the same amount, but negative. So he not only spent, Bolsonaro...
We have to include also account for the pandemic and also
absolutely.
The expenditure.
Yes.
The payments that he was giving for the pandemic. I'm not talking about the health expenditures and everything, but like the economic aid directly.
Yes, but this economic aid is a part of it, right?
Yeah.
Because the way he did it is that he took that assistencialist program called Bolsa Família, which is a reference internationally. It's a great program. It has a lot of things that we can criticize as well, but overall it's a very good program. Then he took it and renamed it, and then he gave more money to it and included more people in his policy to make it through the pandemic. It's something that he resisted a lot in the Congress.
That's true.
It's something that came from the left wing, but it happened in his government.
And he
claims it. And then, of course, you do it during the pandemic. That's one thing. We all know that one of the biggest punches to the gut that you can take as a politician is when you give the population some aid and then you have to retract it.
Yes, of
right?
course.
So now that, quote unquote, the pandemic is done, it's not really, but as we were locked inside before, it is done. So as this goes, what do you do with that type of existentialism? And remember, Brazil is that populous, but it's also one of the most unequal countries in the world.
Mm-hmm.
The social gap in Brazil is one of the biggest in the world.
Oh.
So if you have,
God bless Latin America.
yeah, exactly. Most former colonies, to be fair.
Yes.
That being said, so what goes on with that? It's a huge economy. It's an economy that has it's been growing. The GDP is growing in Bolsonaro.
It's supposed to be the 8th largest economy in no time.
No, I don't think it's really the 8th anymore.
By 2030, 2040, something like that.
Yeah, the place that we've been occupying, it's been that one. Of course, Bolsonaro dropped it a few.
But G20, biggest economy in Latin America,
absolutely.
South America.
So what happens that our GDP is growing and we also have hunger striking the population of Brazil? It's clearly a distribution of that income and how that happens, yeah? So when you do policies like that, and that was, in my opinion, what Lula did best in his government, which was, okay, we're growing, let's grow bottom up, because then all of these people that have no money, they join the economy, they make the money circulate, and then all of these companies that need to sell things, all these banks that need people to loan money, they're going to loan money to those guys that now can buy a car, a fridge, that's all the things he says, and picanha and all of that, it's a Brazilian barbecue. Which really speaks to our hearts, okay? If a dude comes up and says you're going to be able to eat barbecue,
you vote
that's
for
how you
directly.
win the elections.
Well, it's a pity though, the thing that how this massive corruption scandal at the end of the day also tarnish a little bit the whole economic growth of Brazil, etc. I must say also that Bolsonaro, although he always plays to be business friendly, like no regulations, let's privatize state-owned companies, he also faces a lot of criticism from very economically liberal people, because he hasn't really privatized much. He hasn't really done many policies in this regard on a scale that he promised. So he really nourished from, like, as we call it in Brazil, the Faria Limers, the people from São Paulo, which is like the business area, etc. Investment. But at the end of the day, as Felipe says, he spent more than any other government, etc., etc. And his policies are also like very, also following the developmentalist idea.
Not really, no.
In many senses, that's the criticism he gets many times from the very economical liberal people.
Yeah, but that's not very accurate.
Like they say, like, he promised he will privatize Bank of Brazil and he never did.
But that's not necessarily developmentist, right? So, and you had candidacies that would be very developmentists, which is the case of Ciro. But Ciro Gomes was one of the candidates. Very polemic, very funny as well. But that's a topic for another day. The way that Bolsonaro has been questioned about the economy since his first campaign he would come up and he would say, I don't know anything about economy. You got to ask Paulo Guedes.
Which is the super star, Chicago boy star.
He really wants to sell himself like that.
No, that's the thing, that how he was portrayed is like,
absolutely.
This guy knows economy. He was, I think he was an investment banker before. He had his investment company.
A teacher
for
economy in Chile during Chile.
Exactly. So he comes like, he's going to fix all of Brazilian messes.
Absolutely. And Bolsonaro really played on that too. He would say like, I don't know anything about economy, ask him. There was even like one ad that everything you needed, you could go for this store, and people were calling Paulo Guedes this store, because every time Bolsonaro was asked about an economic challenge, a growth challenge, a development challenge, he'd say, well, go ask that guy.
But I think, for instance, with the prices of oil and gas, like at one point Bolsonaro, he wanted to intervene directly on the prices with Petrobras, and the director of Petrobras said no, because that's one thing. When Bolsonaro got into power, eventually the management of Petrobras changed, and they say, no, the prices of gas and oil will follow the ones of the market. If it's expensive, it's expensive. If it's cheap, which is something that didn't happen, for instance, during Dilma.
No, this happened in Temer, and then but then Temer is already kind of the right-wing turn that Brazil does, right? So it's separate from what Bolsonaro happened, but not so much in a way. So what they did is that they indexed the price of the oil, which means that the prices of oil in Brazil are going to follow the dollar prices of oil internationally.
Exactly.
Which is weird because we produce a lot of oil and we have a huge market inside. So it might not be the most popular idea, but in terms of investment, that gives the company a lot of stability and a lot of predictability. So for international investors, that's a good game. For the country, that's much more debatable. But before that, what's weird about Bolsonaro is that Bolsonaro comes from this military. He's always complimenting the dictatorship we had or other dictatorships, to the point that Bolsonaro is given condecorations to Nazi generals recently, right? A few years ago, they've given condecorations.
Nazi generals.
Yes.
How do you give a condecoration to a dead person?
They did it. Well, I'll tell you what. First, you become the president of Brazil.
Yes,
and then you do whatever you want.
You can do whatever.
But the first step, I get the first step, but it's like a consideration post-mortem.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, I mean, they do these things, and then it's something that's not very open or doesn't get as much coverage. And then if it does, it's labeled as exaggerations or drama. But just to go back to the topic. Bolsonaro comes from this very state-centered dictatorship approach focused on the military.
Yeah.
But his politics and his campaign is focused a lot on economic liberalism and the minimum state.
And free market.
So, yes, and free market. So he plays this double-edged sword whenever he needs to answer something and he needs to sound liberal, he's going to send Paulo Guedes into it. And whenever he needs to show the force of the state and centralize things, he's going to go himself as the head of the armed forces. Not necessarily as president, but he rather call himself in some situations as the head of the armed forces. So you see, it's really puzzling because he has this thing of like a lot of state, but no states as well.
It's very useful for him in the sense of staying in power and appeasing at one point one person and the other.
Literally,
so when as for instance, when oil prices increased a lot and people were complaining, especially the union of truckers, he said, no. But what is happening in Petrobras is unacceptable. The company had, I don't know how many billion reais in benefits. Something needs to be done.
Yeah.
He doesn't say like, I'm going to intervene in the company because it's not fully state-owned, etc. But he says something needs to be done. People will be like, he knows. But then he's like, you do see all these state companies losing money all the time. Nobody works there. And Paulo Guedes complains about it and so on and so forth. So it's very useful to play a bit of this, let's say, populist narrative at the end of the day.
No, absolutely.
To try to solve quickly one thing.
If you can play with everyone in the end, I mean, that's the basics with popular narrative. I think it was said in the UK, like Boris Johnson was gonna win the election because he could play socialist and he could play liberal, and that's why the leftists were never gonna win the elections.
See, but this is also because Paulo Guedes is not a developmentist; he's an 80s liberal economist. He's doing everything Brazil did in the 80s and failed. So we know that that's not a good economic policy. The market, though, is relying on that because the international investors. We're very strong. Yeah, right. So for them, that's good. But in terms of Brazilian economy, it's not going to go anywhere with an 80s policy. So it's a bit of a risky business in how you would be betting on Paulo Guedes because you know that the economy is going to be better for multinationals and for international investors. But that also derails the Brazilian internal economy, which means Brazil is not going to grow as much. Brazil is not going to be
I must say, though,
to invest.
The idea of the public spending cap, if the objective is to seek international investment, it is a good idea.
Yes.
Although I think the issue of Brazil is sometimes not much about the public expenditures that we can say. There's always like examples of how they misallocated money, how they pay this public servant a lot of money and they don't do anything, etc. But also the taxes and everything. Like Brazil is a country, for instance, where dividends in stocks don't pay taxes.
Yes.
And when you can trade stocks up to 20,000 reais, which is around 5,000 euros, without paying taxes, right? Which in every other country in the world you could pay for them. So it's like we are overcharging sometimes with very taxes for here, taxes for there, you know, and everything, while other things are not taxed. And actually, this is a thing that feeds inequality. Like,
Absolutely.
The fact that you don't tax the dividends of stocks benefits the rich. Doesn't benefit the poor. Benefit the rich that have a lot of stocks and everything and can live out of dividends. So the question now, because Lula actually, as you said, he wanted like overcome this, like, okay, it's not necessarily a good point to just now completely go and spend as much as we want, but like maybe have an honest debate about the state of public finances. Where do we source our money? Where do we get our taxes from? Who are we benefiting from this system and who we are not? We can try to compensate with a lot of public expenditure.
Absolutely.
But
if you look at Brazilian
we need to
public
get also the income in this regard.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The public expenditure in Brazil is diverse, and then you go and you put a cap on very core areas such as health and education.
Yeah.
Right. It's so why
That turns out in Brazil, for instance, health is an example for many countries.
and so
Like because it works very well.
it really does.
For a country that has the geography of Brazil.
The
it
way
works
that
very
Europe, the European Union does, well, our public health here, it's very based in what happened in Brazil. Lula had to go and talk to Queen Elizabeth before they had their NHS there, and it's openly based on SUS, right? The NHS from Brazil is called SUS.
And the fact that it can reach, we are getting very pro-Brazilian here, right? The fact it can reach, as you put it before, like the capillarity of institutions in Brazil. You can say there's always, they reach the remote place in the Amazon.
It's ridiculous that a country
right?
that had the capacity for vaccinating the population that Brazil had in the past would have problems with COVID like we had now.
No, actually, the vaccination campaign was, the vaccinations campaign that happened in Brazil before the pandemic, COVID pandemic, were always an example.
That's it.
The problem is when there was no political will for doing it and you put obstacles on it, of course it don't happen. And that's why we see all of the bad consequences. But otherwise, Brazil had the means, let's say, or at least the processes to implement and roll out a very good vaccine.
Yes.
We're getting into...
But following a little bit like that, because that's, what you're saying is that Brazil, it's an economy that is strong, blah, 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 but we're talking about inequality then. And one of the biggest issues that Brazil has, it's inequality. Inflation is not extremely high, but it is high at this point.
We have a history of high inflation.
You have a history of high inflation, therefore right now it's not excessively high.
I think it's higher
it's
now.
On 12%.
I'm not too sure about the...
It should be around 10 or 12%, but it's set to increase.
Okay, but like for me to put it as an example, like it's the average of the EU right now.
More or less.
A little bit over the average of the EU right now. Unemployment is 8.7%, the official, more or less. Always this stats, you have to take them with everybody.
Yeah, there's a lot.
But
the informal economy in Brazil is very big.
But at the same time, precisely because of the moment now that the new government is going to enter, what we can expect is a rebound from an economic rebound from COVID.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
So I have two questions in that sense, and one is that economic rebound expected to happen in Brazil? And more, because we would like to go a little bit more into the international arena, is how can Brazil use this international situation right now? How can the government of Lula use this international situation right now with the raw materials that Brazil has, with everything, with now the lacking of raw materials and problems with supply chain? How can Brazil engage with this international community to sell these products? Because during the time with Bolsonaro, it was more or less isolated in many ways. But Lula was characterized for being really open to basically everyone, entering BRICS, closer relations with the other South American countries. Even Joe Biden seems to be relatively closer to, well, relatively no.
But Brazil is a very protectionist countries in its economy.
Like most of the big economies,
give-
like
yeah.
the G20, for example.
Yeah, but
that's-
like
that's
right now,
okay.
but right now, I mean, with there's a lack of there's
But my
literally
question
not,
is-
not even a lack of raw resources. It's like there's a problem with the supply chain that you cannot even connect places, and like you have some places in China that should be
Yeah.
exporting some metals, but they can't because
I think
the port is
the question
closed.
for the government is like this wealth that might be generated, how well it will be redistributed in the country, and will it make a meaningful impact for the wider population at the end of the day? Because
Yes.
if you have, let's say, raw materials, they benefit directly big, well-established companies like Vale, which is one of the biggest mining companies in the world. But how much does it benefit the community? How much it benefits the rest of the population that relies on most of the times services, informal economy, etc., etc. So we might see an economic boom with Brazil benefiting from all this need for, let's say, raw materials, etc., etc. But I'm really worried about if it really will have a big impact on lifting people out of poverty, etc., without good public policies.
Brazil. Alex, you've been so quiet.
I
What is
mean-
your impressions so far as like a more or less an
Well, all the
outsider in this
questions I
matter?
wrote down you stole and asked them before me.
I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it.
No, I mean, I think the main question I have now, because we're talking about like Brazil going forward in the future, but like, and I think when Lula won, everyone was like, oh, far right populism has been defeated in Brazil. Like, oh, how great. But actually, like in the Congress, they gained seats. A lot of the governors have gained seats, won seats. And so will Lula actually be able to do that much? And looking forward, like, is like that Bolsonaro, his ideas and his concepts, they're still very strong in the country. So like, was this really a big win?
Were you a sniper in the army? Because that question is the question, right? Absolutely. That's the most important challenge that Lula has to face now. Oh, two most important challenges. We say that Bolsonaro is not Bolsonarism. But it's just like Mussolini was not fascism, right? So Bolsonarism is still there, still a game. And Bolsonaro is not dead, right? He's still there, he's still playing his game. He has a family that was very involved with it. So no, right-wing populism is not dead in Brazil. And it's not going anywhere. It's actually quite strong. It's, as you said, it's 49% of the votes that we got was following that. It doesn't mean that they're all far-right populism, but it's there. It's a strong player. We cannot diminish that. On the other hand, Lula won. He won in this environment of a more conservative Congress, in a more conservative Senate as well. And he had to do 10 different parties coalition to do so. So yes, Lula is going to have to juggle power to make things happen in Brazil. Can he do it? Absolutely. If anyone can, it's that guy, right? To what expense? Then that's the real issue. And remember, Lula is the guy that's known for the scandals of corruption exactly because he needed people to be on his boat. On the other hand, a lot of this is kind of what's expected from a big economy operating overseas. There's a lot of sketchy things that happen, right? So you'd be expecting that, for example, it's the case of Brazil in Angola, if I'm not mistaken, that the companies that would go do engineering processes in Angola, they were benefiting from a lot of sketchy benefits from the government. But that's also the CIA. That's also how the UK did most of his things. It's part of the geopolitical game. It's clearly not ethical, but it's going to happen. Yeah. So that's one thing. The other thing is, we were talking in the beginning of this conversation how the Supreme Court in Brazil has been involved in politics a lot, and they're being very criticized by it, and that's the basis of a lot of the requests for a coup in Brazil. This happens because if you have three powers, and the legislative is very conservative, and the executive is very conservative as well under Bolsonaro, then it's very easy for you to move forward with very conservative policies. Then it's going to be the Supreme Court that's going to have to hold them back. So they become very active. So now when you have Lula in the executive as a very center-right coalition, and this is something that's very interesting too, because the parameters in what's right and what's left in Brazil have been shifted to the right. So you look at Lula and you say he's a communist, he's a center-left guy, right? You look at Geraldo Alckmin, the vice president, and you tell me he's a center-right. For me, he's a very classic right-winger. He's São Paulo's right-wing, right? It's been always. But now when you have Bolsonaro in the game, He's a center right is even a bit kind to him, yeah. But he's a right wing. It's just that Bolsonaro is so far to the right. That being said, it's a very centered coalition that's in the executive now. What's going to happen with the Supreme Court there? It's going to be a very complex game to play. So we're not, at least I'm not expecting Brazil to come out of the fourth year of Lula. Lula's already said that he's not going for re-election. We know that politicians say that a lot and do that very.
Can he go? I mean, is there a term limit for having successive?
You can go for re-election once, and then you have to step down. But then when you go back, you can go for re-election once, right?
Fun thing for the guys that are for the ones that are listening, Bolsonaro has been the first president in the democracy of Brazil that that didn't get re-elected.
Yes.
Since after the military.
We say that this is an election of many firsts, right? It's the first time that a lot of things happen, but in a way, that's a kind of history, right? History is a succession of first times, in a way.
Yes.
Basically.
Yeah. But to get back to your question, Alex. So I'm not expecting Brazil to, at the end of the fourth year of Lula's mandate, now that we're gonna go back to what we were, like Brazil as this beacon of hope for South America. I don't think that's what we're looking at. I think Lula is gonna have a lot of trouble trying to get things on track, which is going to be a very different experience from what we had when he took over right after Fernando Henrique Cardoso aligned Brazilian economy in the 90s. Yes.
Yeah.
So we are looking into a very different Lula than he was in the past. You're absolutely right.
Okay, cool. And then how would you say that he aligns with the other leftist governments in Latin America, since we were talking about this? Are there similarities between them? Does he work well with them?
Lula works well with everyone.
Okay.
Everyone. The trick is that there is this when you say left wing in Latin America, it's a historical image as well. There's an imaginary about that, because a lot of our independences, they relied on this left wing pushing that, and then imperialism came right after the independences of Latin America, and then the left wing pushed out some of those regimes as well. It's not the case in Brazil, but this really bonds the whole of Latin America in a way, or at least South America. What Lula has always tried to do is that he's shifting the way that Brazil deals with international power from a north-south, as in Brazil being a very good friend of EU and the US and being kind of like the underdog and the powerful. He flips it around and he goes through a south-south cooperation. That's where you have BRICS coming from, which was an economic alliance, and then it became this kind of bloc, kind of, aiming to a political alliance.
It's getting strength now. Because BRICS also.
Yeah, we don't know. With the whole Ukraine situation, I'm not so sure.
Well, but also you have countries entering BRICS now, or applying to enter BRICS now. You have Argentina applying to enter BRICS.
It's not something you apply for in a way, because it's not an organization, right?
At which point Argentina can be still
at what
major
point,
global
at which
player
point Argentina
nowadays,
can be. Well, that's a conversation we'll
Yeah,
have.
but see,
Podcast on Argentina.
At one point, South Africa, for instance, has an economic might and power.
Yeah, but for example,
when you have power outages every day in the country.
In that sense, yes, you have all those problems, but still, South Africa is the second largest economy of Africa, the largest in the south.
Yeah.
Brazil is the largest.
Don't worry, guys. Brazil has oil. We can sell.
See, this is the joke. Minerals, yeah.
That's it. But this is the joke that is guiding Lula's foreign policy from day one on the first government that he took, which is, let's do a South-South, let's do Mercosur, let's bring Mercosur to the standards of European Union. And if Brazil does it, it's very smart for Brazil, because it sounds like, oh, we're so cool, we're so South-South, but it's very imperialistic from our side, right? Yeah. Brazil would go to Africa.
The center.
Yes, the center of South America, and then we have great bonds with Africa because of the tragic past that we have with people being enslaved and brought to Brazil and the diaspora and all of that. But that came to be that Brazil has a very good relationship with most countries in Africa, and that really not anymore. After the right wing took charge in Brazil, Brazil's been removed from it. China took over, so that's China's territory, quote unquote. But that's Lula's game in the past. It's to go there and to do a South-South kind of game, which is why the US is never fully happy with what Lula's doing there. And we can even see that there is a lot of hidden under the table supports to resistance towards the left wing of Brazil. Of course, Bolsonaro was a bit too far, too extreme, just like Trump was. It's not surprising that Biden would deal well with Lula in that sense, but much more as him trying to position himself as an alternative or as an opposer of Trump. And then now, because he opposes Trump, then he needs to oppose Bolsonaro, right? Then really believing that the Brazilian economy goes better under Lula, because for Brazilians, it might, if he is lucky and skilled, I would say it will, but I'm not that optimistic. But it's definitely not as good for the US, because that means we compete a lot, right? Same thing with Europe. And European Union has kicked out Brazilian products with a lot of protectionist tricks, like, health regulations and all of that. Just to be clear, we need health regulations, all right? I'm not saying we don't. Yeah. But there's ways you play this, right? There's geopolitics. Yes. We can't pretend it's not a game that you're playing for power. So this is what I expect from Lula. I expect this South-South alignment more and more. Will he be able to do it with the needs to appease the Faria Limers, as Fede mentioned, which is the investors and all of that in São Paulo? I don't know. I really think he will, because that's what Lula does. On the other hand, it's easy to do it when the economy is going great.
I think summarizing many things is like Lula, like, he's facing a lot of challenges now compared to when he got into power the last times.
Yeah, it's clearly not the same situation.
And we might have a lot of hope, or many might have a lot of hope, that he will try to push and do a lot of changes. But if we are a bit more pragmatical, I think it will prove to be very challenging, So yeah.
Regarding particularly with South America, because there is with all the differences in every government that right now has been elected in Latin America, it is true that there is a shift. Even Colombia has had for the first time a leftist government, and there were certain organizations that were left there after the recent conservative wave in Latin America, like ALBA, for example, was not that used that much, or like they created the Lima Agreement, which now doesn't exist because it was a conservative force. Do you foresee Brazil pushing? You're talking about this South-South, but do you see Brazil more of a global player rather than wanted to establish some stuff in Latin America and South America that would encourage internal growth or common policies, or do you see Brazil more playing
the opportunities
in the international? Because I see, but
if
they want to push whatever.
There's something important, like also the local elites. Like the reason, in my opinion, that we don't have more integration in Latin America, economically speaking, is because there are some local elites, industrial for instance, that they benefit a lot from protectionism. Like Brazil has a tax on every manufactured good that is over $50, and the tax is 50%. So this microphone is actually 50% more expensive in Brazil.
50%, but on imports or also in product?
On imports. The thing is, this benefits local industrial elites. However, they have to still import some things, and of course, this increases the prices, so on and so forth. So, who really benefits from that is that local elite. When you say like, actually, no, we're gonna remove this tax, I'm gonna integrate with our Argentinian brothers, and the Argentinians have their own elites, which are even more entrenched, in my opinion, than in Brazil in some aspects. They don't want to cooperate. They don't want to establish, they don't want to push further. There are some things that they might agree, hey, let's exchange grain, let's do these things and that, but it's always a limit. And actually fighting these local, most of the times, in my opinion, also industrial elites, it is very hard. And without that, you cannot really push for economic integration in the region. Although I will see, like, for instance, more cooperation in politically in many instances, like, or also in organized crime. The fact that, for instance,
I was going to ask
you can talk with Colombia in a more or less friendly way. Well, you can cooperate more in criminal issues, in other issues. Also with Argentina, which was with Bolsonaro.
In fact, that was my master's thesis. I was talking about innovation in cyberspace and how these innovations happen in police intelligence and how these innovations happen in organized crime as well, and how they match or they don't match each other, right? And it was very surprising for me to see that the type of cooperation for organized crime in Latin America, or at least in South America, it's driven by Mercosur. And even if it's not Mercosur, the institution, it's those countries, and then they add their buddies to the WhatsApp group as well, Like, so it's really driven by this. To go back to your question in the beginning, and I think it's going to talk a little bit about the challenges that you've mentioned too, Alex, it's that I think, unfortunately, Brazil is going to try to play a more global game than regional. Unfortunately, because I think the regional would be the answer. Fede is absolutely right about how the elites are positioning themselves in this Mercosul game. I think we could have an only episode about Mercosul. I have people to bring if you
No.
want suggestions.
I really, I want to bring the Iberian languages into this. Into this podcast,
absolutely. She's Argentinian.
Okay, next one is in Spanish and Portuguese.
The Geopolitical Pickle in Spanish.
Coming soon.
No, but
geopolítico.
In any way, so yes, the elites are there, and you can see how unlike European Union, the integration of borders happened much easier to migration in Mercosul than it did to goods and economy. I could go to any of the Mercosul countries with my national ID, and it has official status of a document in any other country of Mercosul. So it's basically an open border, right? Just like Schengen in a way. And you can work, you can do uni there, you can do everything. You can just go there and live there. On the other hand, it's not the same if you want to sell something there, right? As Fede was saying. Yeah. So this is definitely a challenge. And then there's also internal Latin gossip that goes on, Colombia and Venezuela and Uruguay, and there's all that drama that goes there. If you like telenovelas, I really
Mercosur is an amazing one.
Go into Latin American history.
Yes.
But Brazil I think Lula seems to be playing the global agenda more. Yeah. And this, for me, it has to do with what you mentioned, Alex, how this huge challenges of this diverse game that Lula is going to have to play. He's already said, there's this thing that Brazil keeps saying, that we want to be a part of the Security Council. That's absolutely a joke. Like, it's not, first of all, it's not going to change because the Security Council doesn't want to be changed. And they're the guys that are going to say if they're going to change or not. Then Lula goes and says, no, we need a new one altogether. Like, we need more African countries there. And then he goes and he does this very diverse discourse and all. But you can see if he's pushing for that game in the Security Council, in the UN and that sort of stuff, he's aiming globally. He hasn't mentioned Mercosul so far. He might have mentioned the president of Argentina, but not Argentina, our brothers, hermanos. Like, he hasn't touched that.
I think there's more terrain to gain for Brazil in this regard. Like, considering the position that he was very, very diminished by Bolsonaro administrations internationally, the pushback can be bigger than in Mercosur or in regional integration, I would say. It would make it a bigger comeback, especially also for trade. I mean,
including for Mercosur, right?
Yeah, including for Mercosur and everybody else. But like, Brazil coming back to the international arena can, at one side, benefit the local leagues of Brazil, etc. And also, like, there's more terrain to gain, there's more to do than just trying to go again and compete regionally, in my opinion, right now, at this moment. So, yeah.
But when they come to this global arena, because right now, especially like the discourse in the West, is that there's the East versus West game being played, where it's the US and the EU on one side and Russia and China on the other. Where does Brazil envision itself in there? Or is it like, we don't even care about that, we're like a third?
I think it depends on the price of fertilizer.
But you know what? Brazil, our game, our secret card that we always play, the way our strategy book in terms of diplomacy, it goes like, the president doesn't touch this topic. We have a very good diplomatic body. It's been there from colonial times and we're great at that. So Itamaraty, which is this institute, takes care of this, and that's it. And they're actually amazing. They're great diplomats. And then Lula comes in and says, you know what? I want to be international. I want to be a star. And then he does his game, and he's actually very good at it. So there's this thing to look at as well. Is Brazil going to do what Brazil's always done diplomatically, which is great, but it's not necessarily Lula? Or is it going to follow Lula in this way that Lula envisions Brazil in the global market? However, the game that we usually played is of a pendular diplomacy. So not neutrality, but pendular. So it's what Fed is saying. It depends on the price of the fertilizers. It depends on the price of the iron. Brazil has so much iron, and then what? You need Nazis need iron. Okay, it's good money, and then the US needs iron. Oh, that's fine too.
Keep in mind that when you have the focus instead of east and west to south, it is easier to play this pendular game at the end of the day.
Absolutely,
because we are more aligned and focused on the south and African countries, etc. But of course, we need to take care.
But then we cannot expand a really strong Brazilian position in front, like towards anyone. Like we cannot expand that. We can only expand abstentions, so to say. Like we cannot expand that black and white. We need to spend the gray in the international arena.
And you see that even the concept of a third world country, and in my perspective, Brazil is one of the biggest examples of a third world country in many ways. You have the first world, which is capitalism. Second world is communism. Third world is non-aligned. And second world goes off. We don't even talk about second world countries anymore. And then we kind of lose this meaning, right? But that's exactly what it is. It's countries that did not have direct support from each of the sides. So they kind of were left behind in this game of having money to develop your own style of country. It's not fully the history of Brazil because we did align with the US after all, and we got a lot from it, including a military dictatorship and much more genocide. Yes, true.
It's a wonderful condor plan.
Right? But to be fair, it's not to no benefit of Brazil. Industrialization of Brazil happened with the support of the US, and it changed all of the game. So that being said, Brazil and the US, we have forbidden love. It happens behind curtains, okay? But then let's say that Lula is not the person that's more in love in that relationship. And Bolsonaro clearly was. He said, I love you to Trump. But let me tell the joke and say that on the other hand, Obama shook Lula's hand and said that Lula was the most powerful man in the world. So the game is very different with each of them. Now, is Lula playing his game or is Lula playing the Brazilian diplomacy classic game in it? I don't know. He's already talked to he made a polemic statement saying that, you know what, Zelensky is not all that bad, and come on,
all that good. He's not that good.
He's not all that good. Like both of them are guilty for.
Both of them are guilty. Yes, that's
yes.
It's one thing to say that they're not all bad or not all good. It's another thing to say that Zelensky is guilty, right? Yeah. Come on, mate. Don't go there.
Is like a pendular, the best example of pendular diplomacy.
Exactly, right? Like, no, there's wrong things on both sides, which is exactly what we're doing inside of Brazil.
But as you can see, this discourse, he will never use it, let's say, when talking about Angola.
Oh, never.
Like ever. Talking about South Africa, Argentina, any other country, So the focus, because also, I think it's also, in a pragmatic way, where can you have a bigger international impact that can benefit you really more? Like, it clearly benefits you to go to, let's say, Angola and say, we are brothers, same heritage from the Portuguese colonizers, we are fully support you, and then you do business, and that's okay. There's way more influence that Brazil can have in these countries, and that's why they keep a very, this is absolutely how it should be, etc., etc. In the other sense, can Brazil really influence the war in Ukraine? No. Can they benefit from Russian fertilizers? Yes. Can they benefit from exporting meat to Europe? Yes.
That's it.
Let's try to play it. It's not so clear, right? If I'm not in a dominant position in this regard, well, maybe it's not so clear. So,
if anyone can do it, that's Lula. He's this
Sadly, Bolsonaro, the problem he had, in my opinion, he was way too ideologized in his foreign politics, in diplomacy. The example with China not getting the vaccines because they are Chinese made, etc. Like, it ruined the reputation of Brazil internationally just because he applied a lot of ideological concepts, and sadly his foreign minister as well.
Yes,
even though he came from the diplomatic.
See, that's not the foreign minister is a symptom of what happened there.
No,
right?
Totally. Yeah.
Because we had to support the way that Bolsonaro came to power, the radicalization that happened. It comes with the basis of conspiracy theories. They're all imported from the US as well, but from the 60s, right? And then this guy just comes and paints it with a different shade and sells it to Brazilians with the same names, with the same structures. And then when Brazilians look at it, there's a lot that's been said about it already, the globalists and all. And this is a tool that Bolsonaro uses, and the far-right populism right? So this is why I don't think Bolsonaro is worried about the international agenda.
He clearly believes when he says that the World Health Organization created the virus, something like that.
But that's what I mean. He might believe it individually, but I don't think it's part of his policy that he wants to do this or do that or position himself like, right winger. I think he's just playing the national game of being a right-wing populist. And what do you need internationally? So you're the guy that's on my side and you understand about international stuff and you're the minister now. So I feel he's always playing it like this. But this is a feeling, right? It's not an analysis. It's based on how I see my uncles and aunties.
But in future perspective now, let's see how Lula goes. I think the pendulum is a very good explanation.
Historically is what we do, right? Yeah. So let's see. I'm really excited to see what's going to come from it too.
Okay. So I think with this we can finish for today. We've been talking a bit
about
honestly,
Brazil.
thank you very much. I personally learned a lot from hearing you. I don't know, Alex, you?
Yes, no, this was great. This was like a crash course in Brazilian politics.
It was Felipe's masterclass.
I think that's how we're gonna call it actually.
But the Amazon is in Brazil. Wow.
Oh my god. No, I think and we just started saying that there's like around 300 different peoples in Brazil, whatever. I think we went from like the smaller part there to like the bigger part, and I think it's really really interesting. And for that I want to thank you for being today in the Geopolitical Pickle. Again, if you got up till this part of the podcast, Felipe has his own podcast which is called Espetinho Internacional. If you want to learn Portuguese, it's a good idea. If you want to learn about Brazilian politics, it's a great idea. We'll leave the links in the description and everything. And I want to thank you, Fede, for being here today again.
Thank you very much.
And Alex, I want to thank you obviously for being here, even though this is also your program. And to you that you're listening, thank you very much for listening. And we'll come the next week with more The Geopolitical Pickle. Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to Geopolitical Pickle.
We hope you enjoyed the episode and we look forward to seeing you next time.
In the meantime, follow us on Instagram for more behind the scenes content.
And subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast.
Thank you and see you next week.